So you only meet like once a month or, whatever. And then there's online courses where you never meet face to face. But all the classes here are in class and have to meet the whole time. But if you've noticed the way students are here, an awful lot of them can't be at class all the time. And so it's I think, very helpful when I can make it as easy as possible, for people to, etc. So that's fun. All things to all people.
Fun times will have that all.
Yeah, I wore my Scottish tie today.
Lovely. What's the occasion?
A Scottish philosopher.
Oh, fair enough. Okay, yeah, that was a dumb question.
No, not at all. It's got to be an occasion for you to wear a Scottish tie, right?
Usually.
Yeah.
Usually.
This one, by the way, is Clan Cameron.
Okay.
So,
Well,
I don't know.
I can't even
Because
tie
it
it.
says, on,
It says.
it's some.
So it must be true.
Am I Scottish? My mother said that we were English, Irish, Swedish, and French.
Was she right?
So that doesn't include Scottish, but when you get your DNA thing from National Geographic, they told me that my dad was English and Scottish, not Irish. So that's confusing. But I think it's confusing even if you think you're one or the other when you start looking at your history. My wife followed it back, and one of my supposed ancestors was the guy who was in Braveheart. That Irish, Scottish rebel, right? And the trouble was, though, that back around then, people painted their bodies blue, ran around in the nude, and even though they were officially married to some individuals, they actually had sex with anyone they felt like, So basically, who the heck knows, right? Once you get to that point. But William Wallace, that's kind of cool, because he's like the hero. But I suspect he was also a lot like, the Genghis Khan, who basically was responsible for about 3/4 of the Asian population, Everybody's genes show that, Genghis Khan was part of it. But so, I don't know what I am. I'm pretty sure, though, that my ancestors came over on a boat and were slaves to somebody else. So we were pretty dumb. And Irish. Most of the Irish slaves died within like 4 years. So they were actually the first slaves. And they were such miserable slaves that they started realizing, hey, if we buy these black guys from Africa, they last a heck of a lot longer, they work a lot harder, as long as you hit them enough, I guess.
Damn.
And they were a lot more expensive to buy than the Irish, but they were worth it.
They also had indentured servitude before slavery.
Well, there are lots of different names and types of contracts and stuff. Theoretically, you could buy your way out of it, but
True. That proved too
Theoretically.
expensive.
they basically could set it up so that you ended up owing more than you did at the beginning, of your servitude, so
Well, it's
you
kind of
never
like
get out of it.
some of the coal mine towns. Everybody, instead of getting paid money, they got paid a little credit, coins, to use at the company store.
And they always raised the prices, so
And they
you could
always
never
raised the
afford.
prices, and they would always owe more than what they, because they had to feed their families.
Did you ever see the movie The Molly Maguires?
Long
With Sean Connery. So, we've been following a trail of development associated with British empiricism. I noticed on this one, that's wonderful. We have a shredding truck down there.
Yeah, it's just a little weird.
I didn't ask them to shred my lecture, but hey, but notice on this page, this is Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is absolutely right about everything it says. And notice it says here that John Locke, George Berkeley, isn't that nice how that pulls up all their Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes. So that's not the right order, but notice they refer to them all as British empiricists, even though officially you could call them all empiricists, but the term British empiricism really starts with John Locke, because he's the one that noticed that there's got to be a difference between the way an object appears to us and the way it is in itself, because our senses are in between. And so the things look to us the way they look to us, not the way they are in themselves. A bacon sandwich doesn't taste like bacon to bacon. It's a pretty complicated example. I maybe shouldn't have used that one, because I'm not sure if you're thinking pigs eating other pigs. No, I didn't mean that. Actually, an orange doesn't taste in itself, right? Because it has no taste buds, and it's not eating itself theoretically, right? So you get the idea.
It's not meant to.
Yeah. So British empiricism, in that sense, with that particular problem, starts with Locke, and then from there it goes to Berkeley, and then from Berkeley it goes to David Hume, and Hume is the one that officially completes this trip by saying an agreement with Berkeley that, hey, we can't see matter, we can't touch matter, etc., etc. So therefore, it's a contradiction to say that we know that matter exists. So therefore, Locke is wrong in saying that there's matter. But then, in answer to the question, well, how do you account for the stability of the universe? Berkeley gives us the mind of God instead, right? Well, David Hume, of course, says, prove it. And when you get right, well, remember the Samuel Johnson kicking a rock. I refute Berkeley thus, but for David Hume, the point is, at any one moment, I know for sure what I'm sensing, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, etc. The minute, though, I slip into a memory of the past or an expectation of the future, I'm now trusting my mind, which has proven to me to be fallible. I can't trust it on many occasions, depending on the individual, I suppose, and the awareness the individual has of making mistakes. And so, if you're dependent on your memory for anything, you can't trust that. That is not knowledge. So when you get right down to it, the only thing you know with certitude is what you're experiencing at the moment, the impressions you're getting at the moment. Well, this is going to do away with Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, where the I am part is an existing consciousness, because as far as David Hume is concerned, you have no grounds for arguing that your consciousness persists over time. You're basing that on your memory of yesterday or the day before, etc., but your memory could be fallible, so you don't know for sure that you existed yesterday. It's a guess. It's a guess that I'm not just alive just at this particular moment. And the memory I have of me being around yesterday might be a delusion that I'm having at this moment. Who knows, right? You can't prove that. So even the persistent self that the cogito gives us, if you're a rationalist, goes away. There's no certitude with that. And by the way, that's kind of fun, because that aspect of Hume's thought has stayed with us. And you have people today like Thomas Metzinger, with titles of books like this one. Have I shown you this one already? So, Being No One. Since Hume has demonstrated there is no persistent self, you don't have a self, you're no one. All of us are no one. But what do we have? We have instead the self-model theory of subjectivity. So what you have are these processes well, we don't know for sure that they persist, but we have all these processes, and they give us this a feeling of self-reflectivity, etc. Although, if you read the book, he messes with your mind on all of those things, because it turns out that a lot of our feelings about ourselves, even that, this is my arm and I can always trust feeling that this is my arm. No, actually, it's one of his favorite things to do is to demonstrate that you can be disillusioned about this being your arm. He has a fun test that he does with people where he puts like a rubber arm next to you, and yes, you've heard of this, and he kind of ruined, because you begin thinking, oh, that's me, and then you realize, oh crap, my arm's over here, So you can be you're trained to think of yourself as you do, and of course there's the missing limb folks, the folks that have lost an arm or leg and still think it's there when it's not. There's all kinds of problems, but if you think of the brain as a series of processes, like mental events, like a computer software, you can screw with the software, and as I've talked, I think I've mentioned this lots of times. If you think of your self-consciousness as a program that has been taught to you by our society, our culture, it's an app. And not every culture teaches it to people. It does seem like you need to have a modern Western language as a operating system, so to speak, for this app to be loaded. And then it actually matures over time. So the kind of app that a kid is using isn't the same as a 17-year-old who thinks he can torment girls, and that's just fun. And then 20, 30 years, 35 years later, he discovers that he almost gets fired from all opportunities because she finally complained about it. Sorry, that's just threw a tidbit from today's news into it. Right, yes, you're all familiar with Brett Kavanaugh.
Yeah.
Even though you probably haven't seen his, well.
Pull it up.
Yeah, exactly. So, this is fun. David Hume hasn't gone away with regard to
He's chilling.
that. And it's not just that. His big arguments, which are in the section in the book that you have, and my favorite is the pool game, right? You're playing pool, you're shooting the cue ball at the, well, I picked the 8 ball. I don't know what ball he's shooting at, but you're aiming at the 8 ball, and perfect shot, and you sink the 8 ball. Actually, he's playing billiards, not pool, so I don't know the rules for billiards. They're different. They have like little posts all over the dang, and it's smaller and all that kind of thing. By the way, Immanuel Kant made the money that he needed in order to fund his college by playing billiards, gambling. That's just kind of
He's crazy.
Immanuel Kant. So he was a gambler, and that's what paid his way through school. Isn't that kind of weird? But Hume uses this example, and you could set the table up, and you can do it over and over again, and everything should happen exactly the same way, because you've got the shot lined up the exact same way, you hit it in exactly the same place, with the same force. It should always end up happening the same way. And so this is an example of cause and effect. You know, the cause and effect relationship had been thought of as a necessary one. So you know, it's logically necessary. You know, if you do this, that will happen. We've done it before, so it always will do that, right? Well, Hume points out that if I imagine that not happening, I can do that. In fact, my favorite way of doing that is, if you remember Who Framed Roger Rabbit, you know, where, so I'm shooting, the cue ball, it heads right at the 8 ball, and just before it hits the 8 ball jumps up in the air and goes, "Hoo-hoo, you can't get me," and the cue ball spins and says, "Hey, you can't do that," and sinks into the scratch, right? And no, that doesn't happen, right? I slipped into a tune or something. I'm on LDS or something, so that I'm having some kind of a that stuff.
LDS.
Yeah. So.
Or you're in Vegas and the table's rigged with.
Or something, yeah. But there's something different going on here. That really wouldn't happen. But the thing is, David Hume says, I can imagine it. And if I can imagine it, then what I thought of as logically necessary, the cause and effect, are not logically necessary. Because I can think of the contradiction of it, or the contrary of it, right? And if that's the case, then it's not logically necessary. So he says, so what kind of necessity is it if it's not logical necessity? And he answers his own question and points out it's, as a matter of fact, necessity. It's not logical, because I can imagine the contrary happening. So where do I get my, as a matter of fact, necessary connection? That comes from my memory of past events. But that's the problem, because he's already demonstrated you can't trust your memory, and so therefore it's not knowledge. It's not knowledge in the sense that Descartes was trying to reach for, absolute knowledge. It's not knowledge that the scholastics thought they had. Instead, it's what we today, of course, could use, statistical gathering tools in order to give percentages. We might say it's a 99% chance or whatever. The thing is, you've got that little percentage possibility there where it might be wrong. So it's not absolute. And you might think, well, this is really a silly argument. Well, the thing is, he's succeeded in demonstrating that the absolute knowledge isn't there. That empiricism does not give us absolute knowledge. It's instead kind of a statistical percentage of possible right. And notice that even though that doesn't take off right away, it has to go through the filter of Immanuel Kant, although there's also his friend Adam Smith. So I've got, even though I don't have Smith on the syllabus, he's absolutely someone you should be familiar with. In fact, I think an awful lot of philosophy courses just concentrate on the philosophers, and you've got all these other people like Sir Isaac Newton. Right? I think what happened was a lot of syllabi assumed that people were going to find out about all these other people, and so you need this course to get the philosophers, but you're of course aware of British history, Scottish history, all this other stuff, and so we're just filling in this one particular area of it. What I've discovered, of course, over the years is that students aren't coming in with a good basis in history, so I've realized I should fill in some of these other significant individuals so you get a sense of the milieu, not just the one particular. David Hume is not doing all this stuff all by himself. He had a professor named Francis Hutchinson, who is already famous and is considered by many to be the beginner of the Scottish Enlightenment, which is odd since he's Irish, But then there's that confusion, what are you actually, Scottish, Irish, Celtic? Viking, I don't know, who knows, where these people come from, etc. But so Adam Smith is a friend of David Hume, slightly younger, notice, by what, 12 years, I guess? Is that right? Wait, 11 from 23 gives you 12 years, right? 11 from 23. Yes? Okay, so he's 12 years younger. And will live till 1790. David Hume dies in 1776, which is like a real significant year for most of us. We can remember that one pretty clearly because it was such a great year for Pinot Noir that we all remember that year. That's a joke too.
Ha, so funny. I got it.
I knew you would, see. Okay. Adam Smith, why is Adam Smith famous? The Wealth of Nations, which, notice, Wikipedia in its beauty gives you the entire title, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations.
That is a hefty title.
But notice that it's usually just the wealth of nations. That's what people say. And this is considered to be our first official economics book. So it's the beginning of economics. He didn't think of it as that, but nonetheless, it's actually a Greek word that just means the house. If you think of what it's all about, economics, how to keep a good house, but it becomes basically the way wealth is accumulated, how the nation competes with other nations, the wealth of nations. That's his main magnum opus, right? Main work. But keep in mind that the theory of moral sentiments is considered by scholars as the second half of that first book. And that's important because the economics book, The Wealth of Nations, basically gives us that interesting idea of the invisible hand. You've heard of that? So that basically the market kind of will, with its invisible hand, because you can't see it, but somehow the prices will change appropriately. If the guy is not selling his product and he wants to be able to feed his family, he lowers his price. The same, if you're trying to sell a house and it's been on the market for 3 months and no one's come by to look, you lower the price about $10,000 or something. Now you get one person that stops by and they leave. You lower it another 10. You might get a couple people that stop by, but they're still not too interested. You lower it still more, and now you start getting people that actually start to offer and stuff. So the market has the price was lowered by you, of course, but it's this invisible hand of the marketplace that's moving the prices up and down. If you're running out always, what you could do is raise the price, a little bit, and then you'll not sell as many, but you'll make more money, right? So there's all kinds of things in the market that of course, he describes it's the invisible hand. The thing about that is it becomes cutthroat. So the wealth of nations basically leads a lot of people to think in cutthroat terms. And that's why it's important to remember that his second half of this is the theory of moral sentiments that basically explains why people ought to care about those in their society that have the least. You know, those that are ill and need help and so on. They're going to be cut out of the free capitalist marketplace and turn out to be absolutely miserable. And by the way, that kind of ruins your community. A lot of folks will say that, you know, the way you evaluate a community, whether you know it's a good community or not, is the way it takes care of the people with the least in the community. You know, how does it care for its handicapped? How does it care for its impoverished, needy people, and so on, right? You know, if they're all hanging out in one place at the park with nothing, you know, that's bad indication. Not a good community, you know, maybe compared to. How does that explain things like San Francisco, though? If you know, there's all these people that are trying to live as homeless people in San Francisco, which I think is officially the most expensive community to live in. Is that right? Is that part of it? No one knows. It changes. Seattle might be. I know Seattle's prices have gone up quite significantly lately, but you get the idea. There's interesting other dilemmas there, because San Francisco clearly has a lot of programs to help people. It's just that it's become like a magnet, as well as Seattle. You travel around Seattle, and especially downtown, where you'd least expect it, you see clumps of multicolored tents at all the pointy intersect. You know, Seattle has a whole bunch of little triangular. They don't. It's not like Philadelphia. They didn't have rulers or something when they built the streets in Seattle or San Francisco, California, the whole coast. Actually, you could probably blame it on the Spanish, because they made their roads based on how the horse felt like going. Then built places, and then I remember going in Monterey. We finished dinner. We said, "Let's walk around the block." It took almost forever for us to finally realize there was no such thing as a block in Monterey, because the roads just, and there's no bright, it's just hopeless. Okay, so Adam Smith, important, The Wealth of Nations, but don't forget the theory of moral sentiments. They really go together. Otherwise, if you just read the one, you can become, I don't want to get political. So David Hume. So cause and effect used to be thought of as a logically necessary relationship. Thanks to David Hume, it's no longer. It's instead a matter of our statistical memory of what's happened before. We keep track of it. The same thing applies with regard to our notice of what we think of as universals. I'm not sure I've really talked about those at all. Universals are like definitions, the concepts we use for definitions. So a horse, think of everything that's a horse. So it's a universal. A specific horse is of course, an instantiation of the universal. And it also exists, whereas hoarseness may not exist in a sense. What makes an animal a horse, those characteristics, exist in individual horses, but not in the universal sense of what horseness is. Same thing with triangularity and any other noun that you can pick that, in the general sense of the word, the definition of the word, you're talking about a universal, whereas a particular individual is an instantiation of that universal, a particular example, right? Well, how do we know that everything that we clump into a universal, a definitional concept, a noun, like blueness, in a sense, is blue an example of a universal? It's an adjective, but blue things, all blue things, right? And if I say they're all the same color, they're all blue, and they're the same blue, so I know today it could be horrendous where someone says, go buy a can of white paint for the hall, and you go to Sears and you discover that there's 50 different colors that are roughly called white. And you don't want to get in trouble, so you call and you say, okay, so there's pearl white, there's alabaster white, there's sepulchre white. No, I don't think so. But you get the idea. There's ivory white, there's whatever, which one do you want? And of course, if you can't see it, you have no clue what the heck they're talking about because there's so many different ones. Well, so if we're all talking about a particular blue, or we could pick a particular spot on the wall or something, and say that wall is the same color as that wall, then how am I doing it? How am I accomplishing that? And if you think the way I think David Hume is, he's imagining us having these mental events, and the mental event that I'm having that tells me there's that wall there, and then I have that wall over there. They're two different walls, and yet at the same time they look the same in color and texture and all that sort of thing. Well, the question he has is, how? How am I taking two different things and saying that they're the same in any respect? Well, it must be the case that something in those two places is exactly the same. But you can't have the same thing, the exact same thing, in two different places. Because it would only be in one place. It couldn't be in two places, right? So I can't explain the reason that those two walls look like they're the same color when there's no way for me to explain how they could possibly be the same, unless they're in the same place, which they're not, right? I'm not experiencing them in the same place. But keep in mind, of course, if today we're trying to explain how this works, we could add to the dilemma the idea that I've got all these receptors in my eye that are reacting the same way to the light, so that my eye is communicating to my visual cortex that what I'm seeing here and what I'm seeing here are the same. So you've got the added dimension of this energy in my head that's giving me the impression of a multiplicity of similar dots, and actually a lot of that is my memory, right? So that my eyes are not really perceiving every pixel. How would you determine how many pixels are there? There's an infinite possibility of pixels. I'm clearly not capable of seeing an infinite number of pixels because I have a limited number of receptors. Plus, each of them responds to one photon and then shuts down until it's recharged, right? So as my one photon, a photon enters, hits that one, it's communicating with kind of a computer in my eye that tells all the other receptors, okay, look out for this because it's significant and we're going to keep track of it. So all these different receptors are basically trying to follow the movement of this, but they only get one photon each, right? So it's a very complex maneuver for us to be able to keep track of something that's moving, right? So that, oh, there goes the rabbit, or the other day I opened the door to let out my Chihuahua, and the black cat runs across the deck and slides through a hole that I didn't know was there, and disappears. And I'm thinking, oh, I'm glad I didn't just put the Chihuahua down, because the cat might have eaten the Chihuahua, And meanwhile, of course, she had seen it too, so she was a bit concerned. You're going to put me out there in that wild world, I don't, So, there's something that enables you to recognize that that's the same black cat that kept moving from, right? It's not, if I'm looking at pictures like cells in a cartoon or something, right? It would be image, 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 right? Well, we're convinced it's the same cat all the way across, right? And in a way, our eyes are doing the same thing, our minds are doing the same thing, and so on. But what Hume is already kind of leading towards is an awareness that, how do you know it's the same cat? How do you know it's the same? If I say that was a black cat, I've seen black before, how do I know that it's the same black, right? I'm dependent on my memory again, and of course, that becomes a problem when you can't prove that your memory is right? So we begin having the problem that's associated with how's it? Maybe it's in here. Let me see. It's not Hume's fork. Self, practical reason, impressions and ideas.
If we can't trust our memories, then that would sure make court cases pretty hard.
Oh. Well, I have to. I'll throw this in.
Kill this guy.
Yeah, well, I have to throw this in here, and that is that Hume was considered a very practical guy, and so his arguments, even though they just like annoy the heck out of you, his target was not practical everyday usage and science. His target were philosophers who thought that they had proven absolute knowledge, right? And so what he's doing is gnawing away at their certitude, right? And just picking on your memory when it gets right down to it. You can't count on your memory. That's going to screw all this stuff up, right? And it comes from the idea, the British empiricist view that not that certitude that we have is what we're experiencing at the moment. That's the greatest certitude we can have, is that, even if I'm wrong, even if I'm actually wrong, so say I'm on something, or too much of, spaghetti or whatever that, whatever.
Scottish whiskey.
Yeah, it could be, and so in a sense, I think that I'm talking with Abraham Lincoln. But when I wake up, I discover that no, Abraham Lincoln was not in the room as far as John was concerned, right? You thought you were talking to Abraham Lincoln, but he wasn't there. It could be that John is actually wrong, right? Maybe Abraham Lincoln was stopped by. We had a couple of beers, and talked about the Civil War, all that sort of thing. Why not to go to Shakespeare plays, things of that sort,
All right.
Could end badly, it could be a tragedy, you don't want to, However, so he's messing with those folks, but the trouble is, the way we talk about colors and nouns, that horse is the same as that horse, you pick it. You know, whatever you want to mess with. It's a universal problem because where did we get the ability to say that this word applies to all of those things? And in a practical sense, I mean, he's not trying to mess with our heads. He's not concerned about that. He's actually a very extremely helpful person. He's just messing with those absolutists, right? But in an interesting scientific sense, if I see a particular kind of bird, and then I see another bird, I might say, okay, they're both finches. How do I know? Especially if they have different coloring, different beaks. Where do you come saying that they're the same kind of finch, right? You know, so I've got 15 different finches on 3 different islands. You know, there's an overlap of type here and here and here. But by the way, the finches on this island can't mate with this finch. They're incompatible. And yet these finches can both mate with this finch that, right, okay, you get the idea if you've studied that kind of a problem. So how do you know that they're all finches? How do you know that they're all the same species when a couple of the exemplars can't mate with the others, etc.? And they don't really look like one another in a lot of ways. So how do they all get to be called finches, for example, right? I mean, you're making this up, aren't you? Right? You get the idea. There's a problem, yes? And in fact, that's the way we make up nouns in general. Somehow we're creating, we can't have an individual name for every dang thing in the universe. Language would be useless, right? So we create names, and by the way, depending on the language, we might have far more individuals that we're aware of than another language that looks and thinks they're all the same. So the question then becomes, how can we distinguish? I'll just read this is a Ruth Weintraub. I've never read this before. I just did a search. And notice they didn't come up with exactly what I was looking for. I did a paper in college myself on this problem, and I called it the distinguishable as separable principle. And notice that didn't come up very well. But in any case, the problem is, we can distinguish that wall from that wall. They're clearly separable. But of course, when we get down to the problem of how our perceptions derive these differences, we get into all kinds of problems. And it's unsolvable. You might think, oh, well, the reason those two walls look the same is because of the same color. It's not because the walls are in the same two places at once and they're really the same wall. No, it's the color. But notice that just takes it one step further, because now it's the color that's the same in both places. Well, how did that happen? Because you can't have the exact same color in both places. Well, yes, you can. Well, how? Because it's not in two places at once. Well, it's an arrangement of light, which is exactly the same. How is it exactly the same? It must, You get the idea. You just keep pushing it down and down, because if you're saying it's exactly the same,
Can of paint.
somewhere you're saying that there's two things in
Yeah.
you know, that there's one thing in two places, right? And you know, that's how we can, you know, say that those two horses are the same. No, they're not. They can't be, right? You know, the same thing with you know, blue Buicks. You know, there's a whole row of blue Buicks, right? You know, and you can, so there's a blue Buick, there's a blue Buick, there's a blue Buick. That wasn't so hard. It's just if you try to say blue Buick 3 times real fast that you can't, right? But you know, so blue Buick, blue Buick, blue Buick. You know, I got those 3. You know, and you know they look all the same. You know, it'd be hard, you know, the license is different or something, right?
It reminds me of like a 3-year-old, like, why, why?
Yes, and that clearly shows that the child is Scottish.
We were all
I,
Scottish.
Actually,
This is, you know, why you feel like kilt. You know, kilt the. No, I didn't do that right. You know, I was trying to pun on the concept of the kilt. It didn't work. Oh well.
I've never won.
I should have just skirted that whole issue. So the distinguishable, separable principle, or whatever they might want to call it. Actually, you know, I have my own notes as well. Why didn't I even think of pulling them up today? I don't know why. Last notes. Let's see. What do you think? Would it be around here? Nope. About here. Nope. About here. There he is. David Yoke. So, never literary attempt was more unfortunate than my treatise of human nature. It fell dead-born from the press. He was only 18 when he suddenly dawned on him this problem, really, of necessity and memory. And so he basically writes his version of the same thing that we've seen with Locke mostly, and Hobbes, and somewhat with Berkeley. And that is this treatise on human nature, and it goes through the whole business of how we experience things. We get these impressions, right, which are that's his word for our sense data and all of the different kinds of senses we get, and so on. So we get all these impressions, some of which are more lively than others. That's the way he describes it. And you get the impression that the difference is like what we're experiencing at the moment is very lively. You know, this resists my pushing it and so on. Whereas if I'm remembering my alarm clock going off this morning, and you know, I can still picture me, you know, pushing the button, you know, the snooze button, you know, and then I can remember my wife the 3rd time it went off. You know how they do, you know, because they don't have to get up, but your alarm clock is doing a better job of waking them than you. You know how that? Yes, yeah. So she becomes the alarm clock with the foot, you know, and and the alarm clock now is off, right? So I can remember all of that, but oddly, all of those impressions that I just re-experienced in my head were less lively than this, and yet they're all impressions in my head. You know, so all this stuff is in all my experience, everything. Remember the word solipsistic, yes? We're solipsistically trapped in our head. You know, you can't get out of it to see if the world is really the way you're experiencing it. You could be on drugs. You could be, you know, in the Matrix, right? You know, all that stuff. How do you get out of it? So I'm having lively and less lively impressions, which he calls then ideas. My ideas are derived from impressions, though. We can't know anything or think of anything that hasn't been derived from, initially, impressions. But of course, you can explain things like unicorns. I can imagine a unicorn. Where did that come from? A white horse with a horn that came from. Actually, I can picture unicorns because I've seen unicorns on TV and stuff. You know, one of my favorites was the one that the Three Stooges found on Venus, right? You know, if you, yes, whatever. They're flying back in a convertible. Elon Musk, singing, as they're coming back from Venus or whatever. But so you've had impressions that enable you to put this together. It's kind of annoying because it does make you wonder, well, how did they invent things like the typewriter or the light bulb? Things like that. How did inventors come up with stuff that was totally brand newish, in some way? It has to be a combination of impressions that you got beforehand. And by the way, Hume says, all the arguments about God, they're totally worthless, because God is just a hodgepodge of impressions that we make up and argue that that's what God is. And by the way, Hume is officially an atheist. So there are a lot of other philosophers you might think they were atheists. Hobbes, curious, how Hobbes might have thought. But officially, of course, he writes that he's, firm Christian, etc., because he didn't want his head chopped off. But David Hume has no qualms with saying that he's an atheist, and a lot of people didn't like him for that. And yet others who were friends of his, yes, he was an atheist, but at least he was an honest man. And there were issues about burying him, by the way, in sacred ground, because he was an atheist. I think I showed you his tomb already. Bless you. The oddest thing was he wanted to teach at the university and applied to teach there. Would have loved it, I'm sure. But the university pointed out that the main job of the university was to produce ministers. And he was an avowed atheist. So there was like a mismatch there. How on earth do you think we could hire you to teach at the university when you're an atheist? That just doesn't work. And so he was very disappointed that he was never hired to teach as a university professor. He did, however, get hired as the librarian.
Oh, man.
And as a librarian, he actually wrote his most famous work during his lifetime, and that was his History of England, which we have a copy of, by the way, in our library. It's like, I think, 5 volumes, huge tomes. People are discouraged, though, from reading it for the purpose of learning the history of England. And the reason for it is we now know, because we have better sources and better records available than he did, that he didn't really know. And it's not as accurate as contemporary histories would be. But it is worth reading for the language and for the influence that it had on its day and so on, because it was very, very popular. And one of the young men who was inspired by it was Gibbons, who then wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He was inspired by the way Hume wrote his history, and then he wrote the same kind of history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And that's a famous work. Even though, again, the same kind of issue applies to that, we have much better histories of Rome available to us now. Mary Beard, for example, you read Mary Beard's work if you're into Mary. So this little book, yuck, little book. Look, the history of ancient Rome. Maybe even more fun is, especially if you like her sneakers, is watch her YouTube videos. She's absolutely fascinating. In fact, I think I show some. Remember, I use a debate between her and Boris Johnson as a fun share. Okay. So, all ideas are derived from impressions. My idea of God is merely extrapolation. So we basically take characteristics of human beings. He's a nice person. God would be a nicer person. You know, he's a strong person. God would be stronger. You know, right? You get it. We're just extrapolating. You know, if God is all power, you know, God is all powerful. You're powerful, but God is all powerful. So, of course, that gets you into problems. Can God create a rock that's too heavy for you to lift, etc. Well, so I'll keep going down through my notes. That way, it keeps me from. So Hume presents the logical end result of the empiricist position. So it is in his writings that we can see how a conception of knowledge based on sense perceptions leads to the skeptic's position. And it's excellent reading for that. So if you want to see how that position actually ends up playing out, Hume is considered pretty much by everyone, as far as I know, as the best source to do that. I mean, there's lots of people that will try to basically summarize his position, but really, of course, if you want to enjoy the explanation, his work is considered very readable, very readable. So it's not the kind of difficult text that you'll see, for example, when we move on to Kant or Hegel, right? Hume is very, very readable. But of course, it's not the end, because what happens then is, famously, Kant will answer Hume, right? So Hume has given us this problem now, you know, and Kant, who we're moving on to, of course, next. Is he next? I forget. Maybe we have someone else on the way. But Hume, yeah. So Rousseau. I forgot to do Rousseau, even if you don't like him. So we'll do Rousseau, but we'll move on to Kant. In fact, I think I've scheduled two times. So we'll do Rousseau and Kant next time, but then we'll spend the whole next time on Kant. You can't skip Kant. You have to do Kant. But so we'll wonder. Okay, what happens in response to Hume then? And Kant gives us that opening salvo that leads to really the Enlightenment, so-called. It's kind of an odd expression. Remember, this is actually considered to be the Scottish Enlightenment. In fact, if you love books, there's another one that I think is really great. How the Scots Invented the Modern World. That's pretty cool. And of course is touching on even earlier than Hume, but we're talking about how the social contract theory becomes involved in this. So what we've been talking about with regard to Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, we'll discuss his version of the social contract theory, how deadly it was really to France. That's considered, this is a Whig Scottish idea. And remember, the Whigs were also the ones that headed to the colonies when the British beat them, when they tried to revolt against England. And hence we ended up with Whigs in the colonies, and they were the predecessors, thought they were the teachers that gave us people like Jefferson, who then try again, right? You know, so the revolution there is, in a sense, a Whig Scottish Revolution against England, the second one, and this time they had the benefit of distance, and that made the fight a lot more expensive for England. Plus, England was fighting France at the same time, a much more serious opponent, so they didn't really put a whole lot of effort into the colonies. And as a result, of course, we ended up with this fresh Scottish experiment called the United States, which is kind of interesting. And so this is the grounds where the ideas that ends up doing all of that get their basis. And you can see the connection to it to the Calvinists, because the Calvinists, remember Martin Luther, John Calvin influenced John Knox. John Knox is Scottish and heads to Scotland, where he founds the Presbyterian Church, essentially Calvinist. And that's the beginnings of the human as an individual that has rights, etc. So you could trace it, you could see, just connect it, again, where would you say is this the specific point where this all really begins? I mentioned John Paul II blames it on Descartes, Harold Bloom blames it on Shakespeare. You've got all these different folks trying to figure out where the fault lies, as if, but it's clearly...
As if it was really a problem for common people.
Well, it becomes a problem for the common people. I don't know, did I read any of Francis Fukuyama to you guys the other day? I don't know.
Everybody rebelled.
Where's a good spot? I've not been lining in this.
It was more of a problem for the ones
I'll
that
just
were-
pick a spot, anywhere in the book. This is chapter 7, the beginning. Luther, Rousseau, Kant, and Hegel understood dignity in different ways, but they were universalists insofar as they believed in the equality of dignity of all human beings based on their potential for inner freedom. Yet the demand for recognition often takes a more particular form, centering on the dignity of a particular group that has been marginalized or disrespected, etc. He's going to talk about Herder there, which is... But this whole book is all about identity, and so this is the newest I've found of someone talking about how this modern concept of the individual has essentially brought us to this political situation that we're in right now. The demand for dignity and the politics of resentment, which, seeing the students at Yale Law sitting in the hallway demanding that Brett Kavanaugh be investigated before he can come back to teach, right? He's a professor there. I saw a mixture of male and female sitting there, but I was thinking the males are there because they're dating the females, and it's the females that are the ones that are pissed off.
Yeah.
So if you want to date that person and she's pissed off at Brett Kavanaugh, you're pissed off at Brett Kavanaugh. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you don't get a date, right? Is that fair to say? You're
Exactly.
laughing, but
It's
and
accurate.
so when she wants
That's
to
what
go and
happened with the
protest,
60s.
you go and protest as well, right? They're all wearing black. We're all wearing black, right? So, but if you think about it, in a sense, this is, the Me Too, hashtag Me Too thing, that for too long men have treated women as subservient sexual objects, should I be talking about this at all?
Go
I don't
for
know.
it, man.
But you get the idea. Now, you know, the fit has hit the Sean, and we have them demanding equality, you know, so, and they're not saying, hey, when we feel like grabbing you, we should be allowed to. No, that's not where they're going. They want no grabbing, period, right? No drunk parties. Yes, drunk parties. I'm confused about that. So it's not the drinking parties that are bad. It's that while the drinking party is commencing, no one should be taking advantage of anyone else.
Yeah.
Is that right? Is that how that goes? I fail to see how that could work. After all, that's what drinking is for, right?
There's a difference between drinking with your friend and knowing that that girl does not want to go home with you and being like, here, Linda, keep having drinks.
Here,
Now you
Linda.
go home. Be like, there's a big difference between prior relationship.
This whole thing is going to be way more confusing than anything we've seen yet. It's going to be,
Well, it's gonna be so hard to find